Hello everyone. In continuing our presentation of tools used in tectonics, I'd like to present a short lecture on thermochronometry and the use of thermochronometry in tectonics. Thermochronometry or thermochronology is the discipline of measuring the cooling rates of minerals as they near the surface of the earth. This differs somewhat from geochronology in that we're not dating the actual age of a crystal, but rather some cooling event or some time of passage through a particular temperature. So in particular, if a rock, say represented by these stars, is coming up towards the surface of the earth, it's going to come from deep where temperatures are relatively high as it moves up through a set of isotherms representing cooling towards the surface of the earth. Eventually it reaches a point where some daughter product, which I'll explain in a few minutes, is retained within that crystal, and we set an age. So there are a number of different systems, and each of these has a different closure temperature. And again, to define closure temperature, this is the temperature or an approximate temperature at which, above which a daughter product is not retained in the crystal, and at lower temperatures that daughter product is retained. So these are closure temperatures for 5 different systems that are commonly used at relatively low temperature. Argon of mica. This is actually argon 40 to argon 39 ratio of it within a mica, which has a closure temperature of about 380 degrees C. Fission track dating of zircon, which has a closure temperature around 240. There's also fission track dating of apatite and uranium-thorium helium dating of both zircon and apatite. And the relative closure ages, again, going from high to low here on the right. I'm going to discuss the last 2 methods, the fission track uranium-thorium helium methods, in the next set of slides. So these are the minerals then that we would typically use for these low temperature systems. This is a muscovite or mica where the argon-argon dating is used, or zircon and apatite, which are the lowest temperature thermochronometers. Zircon is very common in most rocks, both igneous and sedimentary rocks, mostly because it is extremely resistant to weathering or even to mechanical breakdown. So it survives multiple recycling through the rock cycle of erosion sedimentation. Apatite is also common, but suffers from weathering. It will weather if it's exposed, say, in a soil or in the near surface regime for too long. So it is often destroyed and will not survive more than 1 or 2 cycles of erosion and sedimentation. So uranium-thorium helium dating. This is the lowest temperature thermochronometer that we have, as applied in apatite and zircon. It's a little bit higher, but the method's the same. This dating is based on alpha decay of uranium. So if there is uranium present in a mineral, it will break down to thorium and to helium. That thorium will continue to break down, at least the radioactive isotopes of thorium will continue to break down. And the end product of this reaction chain is helium, or in particular the isotope helium-4. Helium-4 will be retained within the crystal structure, although it will in fact then diffuse out of that crystal given sufficient time and temperature. So helium it's a noble gas. Of course, it's not reactive. It's retained within the crystal structure, but at high temperature, it will diffuse quickly enough that it will actually leave the crystal. It will migrate out of the system. This diffusion is then a temperature-dependent process, and so at low temperature, it will begin to be locked in. So the full chain of reactions for uranium and thorium to produce helium-4 is shown here. Samarium also can play a role if it's present in significant quantities, as it often is in apatite. So these are the radioactive nuclides that are important for the production of helium-4. These are the half-lives for those isotopes. And together then these will combine to give us some sort of production of helium-4 within either a zircon or an apatite. Now the other important dating method or thermochronological dating method is fission track analysis. Fission track analysis is also a parent-daughter relationship, But in this case, the daughter is in fact not an isotope at all. What it is it's a track. It is a zone of damage within a crystal. This is formed through the spontaneous fission of U-238, which is being shown in this little cartoon here. When an atom of 238 undergoes spontaneous fission, the two halves of the molecule are in fact ejected at very high energies through the crystal, and that induces a type of damage within the crystal. So in fact, this is a set of ionization reactions or electrostatic displacements within the crystal lattice, but it ends up leaving then this distinct zone of damage within the crystal. So the parent in this process is U-238, and the daughter product is this zone of damage, or what we call a fission track. How do we measure the daughter product then? Well, we have to somehow be able to observe these tracks, and this is a little cartoon sketch of these tracks. And these can be observed under a microscope through a process which I'll describe in a moment. But the calculation of an age then is based on the density of those tracks within the crystal and knowing something about the uranium concentration within the same domain. So the way in which these are measured is by etching with acid. By etching a crystal with a little bit of hydrofluoric acid, that will preferentially erode out or dissolve the parts of the crystal that are along these damage tracks. So to measure accurately or to count accurately the number of damage zones within the crystal, we undergo a little process, something like this. We have an apatite or zircon grain with these damage zones in them. This is mounted on a thin section slide and then polished. On the upper surface is then polished. It's then etched with acid in order to measure the spontaneous tracks that already exist within the crystal, and these are then counted over this polished surface by observing them in the microscope. In order to measure the uranium content of the crystal, we usually go through another process whereby we take what's called a detector, an external detector, which is just a sheet of muscovite. This is laying down over the top of this polished grain. Then the entire system is then sent to a nuclear reactor, which bombards this with high energy protons, which then, not protons probably, high energy particles of some kind, but this process then induces fission within the remaining uranium in that grain, and that fission will then leave a new set of tracks, which are then called the induced tracks, and these will be present in both the muscovite detector as well as the grain here. So by etching the detector, we can then measure the number of tracks induced by the fission within the reactor, and it's the ratio of these two, the initial tracks and then the induced tracks, that then give us the effective age of that grain. So this is just an example of what these look like under the microscope. This is a zircon grain, and all of these little oblong lines, if you like, here are these fission tracks that are present in the zircon after being etched out with acid. So as a tool, particularly for tectonic problems, this is useful because we can now measure the time of passage through a closure temperature, and not just one, but a whole range of closure temperatures depending on what that system is. And this is sort of a summary plot of a number of the different low temperature thermochronometers that are available, from apatite helium or apatite fission track, which I was just describing, through zircon. This is zircon helium. This is potassium argon dating. There is the ability to measure helium in titanite, zircon fission track, biotite argon, muscovite argon, hornblende argon. So these are the effective closure temperatures. Now, there's another point to be made with this slide, and that is that this closure temperature depends on the cooling rate, which is what the x-axis is showing in this case here. Because this is a diffusional process, depending on how fast the grain is cooling, there will be more or less helium loss during this cooling process, and that changes the effective closure temperature. So at higher rates of cooling, this closure temperature actually goes down. So we have to sort of correct for this or keep in mind that we have also this cooling rate dependence on the closure temperature. On the right is just showing that there are other factors that can be important to this. For example, with apatite, there's a compositional dependence. Apatite has different fluorine-chlorine content, for example, and this can affect the rate or the temperature dependence of the annealing of the fission tracks. And so there's sort of a range of values of the effective closure temperature depending on this composition. This can be corrected for or calculated in order to make a better estimate then. With zircon, there's less evidence of compositional dependence, but what there is a radiation damage dependence on the annealing. So depending on how much uranium or how old the zircon grain is, it will have a different amount of radiation damage within the crystal, and that actually affects how rapidly fission tracks will anneal at a given temperature. And that then translates into a change in effective closure temperature. So if we have this range of closure temperatures through a range of mineral systems, how is it that these then become useful? Well, for example, if we'd like to know something about the exhumation of a plutonic rock, this is an example now from the Coast Plutonic Complex in Alaska, British Columbia. I don't remember which side of the border it's on. But this is showing a number of ages, thermochronometric ages. So on the lower axis is the age. This is now from a single sample or suite of samples probably, but it's a single plutonic complex. And what we've seen is the age and the closure temperature of each of these systems that's been looked at. So from uranium-lead dating, which is really much more of a geochronometer, if you'd like, through these lower temperature thermochronometers, apatite, fission track, apatite, uranium-thorium, helium. And what we see is that this geochronometer, in fact, gives you the time of crystallization of this rock. So this plutonic complex was probably in place somewhere around 60 million years ago. Cooling was then relatively rapid for the next 10 million years. 10 million years later, the zircon, uranium, thorium, helium ages are being set. So they're about 50 million years. So it cooled rapidly for 10 million years. And then we see a relatively slow cooling. This is found at the surface today, so it should be at 0, 0 here. And so what we're seeing is a relatively slow cooling from about, and steady cooling, I might add, between about 50 and 0. So presumably this represents the erosional exhumation of this plutonic complex, whereas this represents the diffusional cooling of that igneous body after it was emplaced. Any complexities in this path then can be interpreted in terms of, say, tectonic processes, faulting, orogenesis, crustal thickening, things that are going to then lead to exhumation and erosion of these rocks. Another way in which thermochronometry is used to try to get at this exhumation history is by looking at the relationship between a cooling age and the elevation. Now, this is useful because if we think about, say, a mountain and valley system, like here on the left, for example, if the closure temperature or the closure isotherm for this system is horizontal, but we have topography on the upper surface, then every rock that is taken from this surface along, say, an elevation profile from a deep valley up to a high mountain has a different path length. Right? It's a little bit longer for a rock. The distance is further from here, from this point to this point, and that implies a difference in the time that it takes to arrive at the surface from the time of closure. If it takes longer to get to the surface, that means the age is going to be older. So if we look at ages that are collected from low elevation to high elevation, we expect, and in fact find, that they get older as you go up, say, the side of a mountain. So here's the elevation. This is the age for a set of samples that are collected, say, along this sort of a traverse. And this is the change of age with elevation. Now that's a linear relationship, and the slope on that line is in fact the rate of exhumation. So if that rate of exhumation is related, for example, to the rate of slip on a fault that's bringing this this rock up to the surface, this is giving us slip information on that faulting system. So in practice, let me just show you one example. In practice, then, the best way to apply this is to find a large elevation gradient or large elevation distance and collect samples from low elevation to high elevation. So here's a nice example. This is the Denali Mountain in Alaska. So this is 20,000 feet high, which you have to go look up if you don't know how much a foot is. The valley at the bottom, or this plain at the bottom, is very close to sea level. It's under 1,000 feet of elevation. So this is a huge relief change from here to here. And by collecting samples then from, say, the summit of Denali down the mountainside down to low elevation, we can then obtain a large elevation difference, which should have a corresponding age difference. And in fact, the numbers on this figure are the apatite fission track ages for the samples shown in red here. So they are, and you can see that when you get up near the top of the mountain, for example, these are something like 16 million years, so 10 to 16 million years up here. We go down to lower elevations, they're something like 5 or 6 million years. So there is a gradient in age with elevation. And if we plot that up, this is what that looks like. So these are, you can ignore the histograms for now. We're not going to talk about this. This has to do with the length of the tracks, which is additional information. But the important data are the circles here, which are showing us the elevation against the apatite fission track age. And these circles then are all of those data that I just showed in the previous slide. What do you see here? Well, you see that there's in fact two linear sections, one with a gradient shown by the blue regression and one with the red regression. That means that there are two different cooling rates or two different exhumation rates for this suite of samples. There's one for the ages of about 16 to about 6 million years. And then there's a second gradient from about 6 to 4 million years, which is much steeper. Again, the slope on this line is the exhumation rate or the erosion rate. Same thing, really. Here this is low, here this is high. That means that there was a low rate of exhumation up until about 6 million years, and then the rate of exhumation was very high for the next at least a couple of million years, but there's probably no information for the 4 to 0, so you could in fact presume that this is going all the way to the present day at that high rate. So as an interpretation, then we'd say something happened somewhere around 6 million years, which changed the rate of exhumation for this massif here. And we can start to then make interpretations of the tectonics with data like this. And I'll just bring in this one tectonic map, which is showing now where these data were collected from. This is the Mount Denali is somewhere around here. This is the Alaska range in here. This is being uplifted because of motion along the Denali fault system, which is a large strike slip fault system that's coming up here. The plate boundary is a subduction boundary here on the south edge of Alaska. And in fact, what has been noted independently is that the relative plate motion has changed over the last 6 million years. And in fact, prior to about 5.6 million years ago, the motion was like this, following the green arrow. After about 5.6, it followed the red arrow. So this change in direction of the plate motion is going to translate into a change in the relative importance of this Denali fault system. If we either increase the slip rate on this fault system or make it more oblique, there's a stronger component of convergence in this area, and this could potentially lead to higher exhumation in the Mount Denali region. And this then would give us an explanation for why the rates of exhumation have increased at about more or less at this point in time. All right, thank you for your attention.